There are few franchises in the world of gaming that have touched the hearts of many like Final Fantasy has. Whether it's the mainline entries or its many spin-off titles like Final Fantasy Tactics, Squaresoft, now known as Square Enix, has one of the most recognizable role-playing games in existence. Dating all the way back to 1987, Final Fantasy has ingrained its roots into retro and modern gaming, having entries all the way up to 15 in its main series. In the beginning of the video, you might have noticed I showed all the Final Fantasy games except for one, which is obviously the subject of today's video, Final Fantasy XIV. 14 is the second of Square's MMORPG fare with the series, originally starting with Final Fantasy XI, having 14 being somewhat of a sequel or successor to 11. Back in the early 2000s, if you told me that Final Fantasy would have a large multiplayer game that you could play within the world of those games, I would have told you it was impossible. Fast forward to 2020, we now have two MMORPGs within the world of Final Fantasy, with 15's multiplayer being arguably a close third. Over the past couple of weeks, I dove back into 14 after initially trying the game during its launch window. The release was pretty lackluster and pretty infamous, leading to a massive rehaul of the game that would become known as A Realm Reborn, or Final Fantasy XIV 2.0. There has now been several expansions for 14, and it is now considered one of the most played MMORPGs in existence currently. So after pouring a ton of my time into this massive game, is it worth checking out? Let's talk about Final Fantasy XIV.
Let us give the bard something to sing of.
Final Fantasy XIV initially launched back in 2010, with the Realm Reborn relaunch releasing 3 years later. Final Fantasy XIV's initial history is actually pretty interesting. Essentially, the launch version of Final Fantasy XIV was such a negative blow financially to Square Enix, it caused the development team of the game to more or less overhaul everything from scratch. The original Final Fantasy XIV was clunky, aimless, and suffered many of the same problems that dated Final Fantasy XI, so understandably, it was received poorly. Current-day Final Fantasy XIV adapted many of the modern-day features that tend to be favored within the MMORPG genre, with its own Final Fantasy flavor. To summarize 14 quickly, it's a theme park MMORPG with a large focus on storylines introduced in each major expansion and updates, with some light sandbox elements. For the most part, 14's story is what the development team wants players to experience, with a shared world experience being within an MMORPG. So where do I begin with what Final Fantasy XIV has to offer? Let's start with character creation. When you begin your journey in Final Fantasy XIV like other games, you get the chance to choose from many different races the game has to offer. In 14, there is the Hyur, which are humans more or less, the Elezen, which are elves, the Lalafell, which I guess you could relate to hobbits, the Mikate, which are like a cat-like race carrying over from Final Fantasy XI, the Rogadin, which are giants, the Aura, which are dragonborn-like creatures, the Hrothgar, which are lion people, and Viera, which is the female bunny-like race. I'd love to make a lewd joke here or something, but in all honesty, it's just a bunny girl, so yeah, nothing else to say.
I beat the out of my
Each race also has two different types of clans you can choose from, which further augment your look and starting statistics. Your starting stats, which are broken up into strength, dexterity, vitality, intelligence, and mind, all have slightly varying amounts depending on your race and clan, but in the long run, don't really impact a whole lot, so it's encouraged to pick and choose what you want to play, unless you are mid-maxing. Once a race is chosen, you then choose a class to begin as out of the choices of melee, ranged, or magical classes. Finally, you then choose a deity choice, which very slightly affects your elemental resistances, which overall, like your stats from race choice, aren't going to be anything you should worry about too much. Going back to class choice, Final Fantasy XIV's class structure works like it did in Final Fantasy XI, with vast improvements. You see, unlike other games that lock you into one class your whole career, encouraging you to create multiple characters, 14 allows you to change your class simply by swapping your weapon within the game's gear system. Let's say you began the game as a gladiator, but don't seem too keen on how it plays. Well fine, go grab a spear and become a lancer. Hate being an archer? Pick up a staff and play as a thaumaturge then. Even further, certain classes actually advance further at level 30 and become advanced classes like the Monk or Paladin. The caveat to this system, however, is that you do need to unlock each class to be able to play as them, but typically it's pretty easy to do so if you follow along the main storyline quest, you'll unlock them all. Professions also work like classes in 14, since classes are broken down into essentially two types. Battle classes, which are labeled as Disciples of War and Magic, and then your crafting and gathering classes called Disciples of Land and Hand. Your battle classes all have the normal roles. Your tanks are the Paladins, Dark Knights, Gunbreakers, and Warriors. Your melee DPS is Monks, Ninjas, Samurais, and Dragoons. Range DPS is the Bards, Machinist, and Dancers. Magic DPS is Black Mages, Summoners, Red Mages, and Blue Mages, with healers consisting of the White Mages, Scholars, and Astrologian? Sorry, it's really hard to pronounce that.
Astrologian.
The crafting classes are Alchemist, Armorer, Blacksmith, Goldsmith, Carpenter, Culinarian, Leatherworker, and Weaver. Finally, the gathering classes are Botanist, Miner, and Fisherman. All of these classes can be switched to on the fly, with you being able to even save gear sets with the menu, with more slots being unlocked as you unlock classes. Essentially, with this system in place, you can theoretically play one character your whole Final Fantasy XIV career, unless you want to try a different race or play on a different server. Going further into server choice, there are a ton of servers to choose from. I mention this mostly because if you do plan to play with friends, you will want to choose a server that is not overpopulated and one that both of you can create a character on. Unlike other games, Final Fantasy XIV breaks servers into separate shards simply because of its massive player base. This is actually slightly beneficial to players since they also break certain servers up by region, so they have North American, European, and Japanese servers, all with respective subdivisions as well. For instance, I play on Behemoth, which is an East Coast server, which helps improve my connection versus, say, a West Coast server. Anyways, getting back to gameplay, once your character is created, you are plopped into the world of Eorzea, in which you will do many of the activities Final Fantasy XIV has to offer. For the most part, your early gameplay sessions will consist of unlocking classes and playing through the dozens of hours of story and quest content. Unfortunately, not all of that is fun, however. Story quests, and really quests in general in the early game, are largely repetitive fetch quests, which will usually have you walking from point A to point B or interacting with certain objects. Nothing special. Later on, quests do get more exciting, especially with the storyline, but it does take a bit of work to get there. Besides unlocking classes, Final Fantasy XIV also has a ton of side content to explore. Things like crafting, obviously, socialization with other players, PvP, reputation farming with factions, mountain pet gathering, achievement hunting, log completion from crafting, gathering, sightseeing, fishing. The game just has a ton of content. There is even a Final Fantasy VII reference in the form of the Golden Saucer. In this area of the game, you can play slot machines, bet on gambling games, and even play the amazing card game from Final Fantasy VIII, Triple Triad. I about my pants when I saw this minigame when I was online. And yes, it's fully in-depth just like Final Fantasy VIII, where you can collect tons of cards and play tons of NPCs within the game, even other players, and participate in ranked tournaments. Combat in Final Fantasy XIV is your standard tab target fare. Simply click an enemy or tab to them and use your abilities if you are within range. If you play on PlayStation 4 or use an Xbox controller on your PC, you would use the analog stick to select, or the L2 and R2 or trigger buttons to select spells and abilities within the console menu. Besides quests, the game also has dynamic events called Fates that players can join in on the open world that will have various objectives for players to complete and gain experience. 14 also has a great feature in place that allows anyone to essentially play with each other no matter what level they are using the level sync system. This feature essentially crunches my level down to a range that the content is meant to be played at, but I still get rewarded with experience and items for doing so. Dungeons within the Duty Finder also follow this pattern, so don't be afraid to queue for anything on the menu even if it's lower leveled. Speaking of the Duty Finder, there are tons of different pieces of content to experience and queue for. There is trials, dungeons, raids, triple triad tournaments, PvP, all forms forms of content to experience. The lowest amount of players is 4, with content going to 8, and then finally 24 players for PvE. PvP has different modes as well. Games like Rival Wings, Dueling, Arena, Frontline, Siege, Shatter, etc. PvP does have to be unlocked at level 30, however, but you do get scaled up to be able to PvP no matter what level you are from then on. A lot of content sort of follows that policy of having to be unlocked to be able to experience it. Things like Triple Triad, classes, crafting logs, PvP, dungeons even, all have to be unlocked through storyline or quests related to that content, but overall, it does ease you into the feature, so nothing should ever be confusing to players. Player-owned housing is also within the game, but from what I could tell, getting a housing plot is incredibly difficult, which is a shame considering how much you can actually customize a house. Like seriously, it's ridiculous what you can do with one. The amount of dungeons I saw in the game, or just 4-player trials you can participate in, or content in general, just blew me away. But to be fair, the game is 7 years old or so at this point. I suppose last topic would be endgame, which consists of a few different things. Endgame in 14 is widely subjective. You can do things like the current raids to get the highest gear obviously, which is what most people will most likely want to do anyways, to get prepared for the next patch. Maxing out every class is also another common activity that endgame players will try to do, and with the wide variety of classes to choose from, it is going to take a while to max everything. Then there are things like achievements and collectibles. This would include completing all the logs, getting all the triple triad cards, getting all achievements, achieving max rank in PvP, collecting mounts, etc, etc. For the most part, endgame has many choices, which is why some people even argue that FF14 doesn't even really have a strong endgame. For me currently as a player not at endgame, I'm completing everything I come across with things like levy quests, which are quests that help you level faster, moving me along at a good pace. I think it's about time I started to wrap things up though, so here are my thoughts. Final Fantasy XIV has a ton of stuff to like about the game, so I'll try to narrow things down. The game is pretty easy to casually play with friends, since it has a pretty big emphasis on story and playing with anyone at any time, no matter what your level is. If you love Final Fantasy in any shape or form, you will absolutely adore this game. For me, especially as a fan, I was smiling from ear to ear when it came to some of the references I came across, especially Triple Triad. Speaking of Triple Triad, there is quite a bit of minigames to experience, so if you are tired of the normal grind, go hang out and play games, or play some cards within the world. Population within 14 is very healthy, so finding people to play with is relatively easy, especially if you reach out to many of the free companies within the game that will take in new players and teach them the ropes. For a game so big, everyone I met was really friendly and easy to play with. Typically in a game of this population, the toxicity of players tend to seep through, but that did not seem to be the case in this experience. Crafting is incredibly fun in its own right with the minigame you play during anything you craft. It always feels rewarding whenever you craft a high quality item that was of a high level. The art and music of the game is beautiful. Much of what you listen to and see will be very polished, which to be fair, it does come from Square Enix, which is more or less known for excellent quality when it comes to their graphics and music. With the game's age comes tons of content. If you plan to play Final Fantasy XIV seriously, be ready to be playing for a long time because there is a lot to experience here. Lastly, the game is actually crossplay compatible with the PlayStation 4, so if you have a friend that's on console or PC, just find a server to convene on and you can play together. Since the game is not free to play, you do have to purchase the game to start playing. Currently at the time of this video, the complete collection is around $60, with the game occasionally going on sale every now and then. In addition to purchasing the game, it's not free to play either, so there is a monthly subscription fee. While someone like me is used to a monthly fee, those who would have been spoiled by free to play games might be turned off by its pay-to-play nature. The cash shop is very similar to World of Warcraft, having level boosts, race changes, storyline skips for conveniences. It's a bit on the pay-to-skip side for those items, and while yeah, nothing is overly paid to win, some of the items are just downright expensive. Some of the mounts or pets can be upwards of $20 or so, and it's just a bit puzzling as to why some things are so expensive versus others. The game feels a bit restrictive in where you can go. Sometimes there can be a large opening you are trying to get past, and just because the map is restrictive, you'll run into an invisible invisible wall pretty often. It can pull you right out of the experience. Quests from the storyline are pretty repetitive and can get a bit samey, which is probably why they have the option in their cash shop to skip story quests. Combat in general is a bit slow, I would have to admit. There are times within combat that you seem to be just sitting there in place waiting for your global cooldown to end, which some may find a bit boring. PvP seems to be a bit of a secondary place in Final Fantasy XIV, with most seeming to ignore it. This is a shame considering there is potential here for good PvP gameplay. It just seems to be ignored because of slower combat and player lack of interest. Lastly, the game has a pretty terrible service site. When I tried to reactivate my account to start playing again, it asked me for my user ID, which apparently is different from my email. Then it asked me to set up a one-time password. Then on the product page to buy the game, it takes me to another website where I buy it. But then I have to wait for an email. Ugh, do you see where I'm going with this? It's a bit archaic in design, so I do wish that purchasing the game and jumping in, at least for PC, was an easier process. Phew, that is Final Fantasy XIV, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for watching my video on it. Let me know down below in the comment section if you are currently playing 14, used to play 14, or are thinking of playing it. I respond to every comment on my videos, so let's start a discussion. Like everyone else on YouTube right now, if you liked my content, I ask that you please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Every like and subscribe truly helps, so trust me when I say I really appreciate it. There is my social media accounts like Twitter and Discord in the description below. And finally, I want to say thanks to each and every one of my loyal supporters who comment on every video and give feedback. Once again, you are amazing. Anyways, that is all for this video, and I will see you in the next one.